What I'd like to share with you is an understanding of chesed. And we'll move, hopefully, Be'ezras Hashem, from chesed to gevura and from gevura to tiferes. But as we know, chesed is loving kindness. Chesed is an expansion. I'd like to ask a question, and I think that this question is it's very, very important because we're stuck in a reality today where we constantly hear about the ego and that people are living with too much ego, they're not giving enough and they're not kind enough. I'd like to disagree, actually, because I think in our world there's a tremendous amount of giving. There's a tremendous amount of tzedakah, there's a tremendous amount of loving kindness. There's so many organizations of support, and you can go from community to community, and there's so much good that's happening. And when we speak about, the iPhone and the iPad and the I, it's all about the I. I really do believe that most of us may not think that we are an I sort of person. I think that a lot of people are prepared to give. I know in my life, I meet so many people and they're so kind and so good, and they will often ask me, Rabbi, how can I help you? What can I do for you? What can I do for your community? So I think it's a little bit misleading when we constantly hear that we're so egocentric and we're so ego-driven. And I think that a lot of people, maybe we can suggest lovingly and respectfully, don't necessarily understand the inner dimension of this, and that's what I'd like to hopefully express. There's a subtlety that exists in reality that I'd like to try and uncover a little bit. So first and foremost is that when we hear this idea that we're so selfish and we're so egocentric and we're so ego-driven, most of us don't put ourselves in that boat. Because we may find in our life that we are giving. We may find in our life that we are compassionately listening to the best of our ability. Even within our whole households, we may find that we're trying to do chesed. I'm doing chesed, I'm helping people, I'm giving of myself, I'm giving physically, I'm giving emotionally. So I'd like to start there. And unpack that a little bit to try and come to a deeper understanding of how there is a truthful chesed and actually how there is a ego-driven chesed. And let's try to understand this. Let's try to open this up. What we can suggest is that, as we've spoken about before, we have a nefesh. And our lower self, our nefesh, codes history. We code through all the experiences of life. And through that codification, any time we're meeting a particular moment, what can happen is that we are communicated expectations and assumptions of how I should relate and react to this particular experience. So for example, if a person meets somebody and they look a certain way, all of a sudden there's a dictation of potentially how we should relate and react to the person because of how they look. Or for example, if a person has some sort of fear or insecurity, say for example they're scared of a dog, as we've mentioned before, what's going to happen? There's going to be an internal communication of how to relate and react to this communication of having a dog in front of myself. So my heart rate may start to race. Chemicals in my body are going to become generated. There's going to be thoughts that I'm going to have, images. And what happens is before I know it, I'm relating to the experience, not actually to the experience. I'm relating to my memory, my expectations and my assumptions of how I should be relating to it based on my history. So let's give an analogy. There's a husband and a wife, and the wife is cooking, and the wife is spending time, Erev Shabbos, preparing a delicious and beautiful meal for the family. Roast potatoes and chicken, parsnips, chopped liver and chicken soup, dessert. Really an unbelievable meal. And the husband walks in, and the husband says, "My darling, my sweetheart, I would actually love to have a simple meal. I don't want such an elaborate meal. I want a simple meal, just a really simple meal." And the wife turns around and says, really upset, "Can't you see what I'm doing for you? Can't you see I'm doing this for you, and I'm doing this for the children? I'm working so hard to prepare for you a beautiful Shabbos." It could be, for example, a husband who's working so hard at his business, and he comes home really late, and he's spending hours and hours at work. And the wife says, or the children say to the father, "I'd love it if you can come home more." And the husband turns around and says, "I'm working so hard. You think I'm doing this for myself? I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this for the family." And what it sounds like is that these people are doing something really holy. They're doing something really precious. Look at this. They're working so hard for the family. They're working so hard for the family. But actually, what we can suggest, it's a false chesed. It's actually not doing for the other. They're actually doing for themselves. Let's open this up. Let's break this down a little bit. What we can suggest in the world of chesed, that a person could be feeding their expectation and assumption of how something should be, could be, would be. They are actually feeding their nefesh. They're feeding their ego. They're feeding off their ego. So it could also be, another way of saying this is that you have a couple and they just get married and they come to the Shabbos meal Friday night, and there's no wine and there's no challah. And the wife is upset because there's no flowers. And basically what's gone on, in the wife's house, the father always bought flowers, Erev Shabbos, and also the challahs and wine. That was his job. And in the husband's house, the husband never bought flowers for the wife. She actually didn't like flowers. They just die and it's a waste of money. And the wife came home with the wine and challah. So each one had an expectation and assumption. And because there was a lack of communication, the expectation and assumption was not met. What we can say is that we all have our ways of doing things. We have our ways of what we can label chesed. That this is good for the family. This is what I label chesed. Look what I'm doing for you. Look at this goodness I'm doing for you. Yet actually the goodness that's being performed is a goodness that's coming from my internal expectations and assumptions. Why? Because did I ever stop to ask the other actually, is this how you like it? Did I ever stop to think about the other? Did I ever stop to ask, do you like things this way? Do you like it when I'm cooking this sort of food? Do you like it when I'm working so hard? Or did I take it for granted? Did I say, this is what chesed is, according to my codification of chesed, according to my expectations and assumptions of chesed? So am I actually doing a chesed based on what I think chesed should be? Or did I stop to ask? Did I become aware of the other person in front of me? Did I actually ask them? So it could be for this husband who just got married. Yes, it's true to say that his mother actually didn't like flowers. And if his father bought his mother flowers, she would laugh and she'd say, why are you doing that? It's horrible. It's a waste of money. Please don't do that. So he didn't buy his wife flowers because in his coding, that would not be considered a chesed because of how his mother related to that situation. But in this new relationship, newly wed, he should have, but he didn't know any better. He should have stopped asking and says, actually, what do you like Erev Shabbos? What do you like Erev Shabbos? Would you like flowers Erev Shabbos? And she may turn around and say, actually, I would love flowers Erev Shabbos, yes. So what we do in life, I can suggest that we have this reality of a ego chesed, a nefesh expressed chesed, and an emesdika chesed. The emesdika chesed, the real chesed, is when I've stopped and I've adequately communicated with the other. How do you actually like this? Or what actually do you want? And then I supply what that person wants. A false chesed is when I'm feeding my ego. I'm basically doing what I consider a chesed based on what makes me feel good. It makes me feel fulfilled. It's about me. It's not about the other. So what I can suggest, again, the takeaway here is that there's two worlds of chesed. One world of chesed is an ego-driven chesed where actually I'm just feeding my expectation and assumption of how something should be based on my history, based on what I've noticed in life, based on how I was brought up. Maybe it's even based on things I didn't like that now I want to rectify, overcompensate. That's a false chesed. But then you have a real chesed where I'm in the present moment and I'm communicating to the person in front of me. And I'm adequately communicating to assess what really do they want. Not what do I want, what do they want? So in the case of the wife working so hard in the kitchen, she turned around and says, you know what? Until now, I've always been presenting what I think a Shabbos table should look like. And now I'm hearing actually you just want simple food. And maybe he would turn around and say, the reason why I want simple food is because you are exhausted and you fall asleep and we don't have a Shabbos meal together. So maybe what we can suggest is, let me help you cook, maybe cook already on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, maybe freeze some food so you can have your experience of what Shabbos could look like. But as well, maybe what we can do is simplify the Shabbos meal, that you can come to the Shabbos meal, that you're not a shmata. Or maybe the husband who is a workaholic will turn around and say, my gosh, look at this. I've always been relating to work as the greatest chesed. Look what I'm setting up for you. Look what I'm doing for you. But now I'm coming to realize I'm just feeding my own ego because I have either fears or insecurities that I'm afraid to meet. I'm afraid to be at home for whatever reason, and I have to work on that. So the takeaway is, am I living a false chesed? Am I presenting a false chesed? Or am I presenting a real chesed? And I think what we can suggest is that when we're speaking about an ego-driven generation, as I said, I don't think it's an ego-driven generation the way people are coding it as an ego-driven generation, because there's so much good in the world. People are doing so much kindness. There's so many gemachim. There's so much caring. There's so much love, and there's a tremendous amount of respect. Yet where's it coming from? Is it coming from the ego? Or is it coming from a recognition of actually what the other wants and giving what the other wants? So hopefully in the next video, the next time we meet, we'll speak about Be'ezras Hashem, the work that we can do to come back to balance and homeostasis.